Hey, I'm actually making this recording now after class ended, in fact, after our morning worship, because I'm adding a little bit more at the end that I didn't get to in class about some of this stuff going on in our culture that I'm spending too much time on it in class and we need to move on. But I have to get in a few more examples of some really alarming things that I think are worth including. So I'm tacking those on after the class time ends, so stay tuned for a little bit extra there at the end. Thanks. Oh, and after the part about abortion, stay tuned just for that little extra. You get to see the cool shoes I wore today. You don't want to miss that. I'm just recording this little piece right here to show what class we're in. Yes, we are doing Romans chapter 1 still. All right, so let me explain. I'm recording now too for the video upload later, but let me explain what I'm going to try to do here in a minute. I thought I could just play this clip and that the audio would work through the speakers and you'd be able to see it on the screen. But I'm not going to be able to do that. Hopefully, I'll be able to go home later and get it to work and get it in the recording that I'll upload to the Kiss the Sun YouTube channel. But the audio will at least be on the stream, but the whole video clip will be in the file if it all goes according to plan. So you're not going to see anything for a minute. But what it is, since Paul here is talking about the wrath of God, Romans 1, yes, we got to the end of the chapter last time, but there's some things I want to address, some loose ends I want to tie up, a couple of things from the very end. I kept saying there were things in verse 31 at the end of the chapter. Verse 31, when we get to verse 31, well, I'm hoping to get down to verse 31. I meant verse 32 at the very end, the last verse. But there's some things I want to address about this whole issue of the consequences of denying God and how we're seeing that play out before our very eyes in an escalating way in our own cultural moment here as God's people. We're living through the kind of conditions I think that Paul describes there. But what's happening is, as we've been taking our time going through this here in Romans 1 and having a lot of discussion on it, I go home then and then each week, I hear something new that is exactly the kind of thing that we've been talking about in class. There's something else in the news, some new development in media or in entertainment or in government or in the whole cultural situation. And so after we've been talking about all this and the wrath of God revealed from heaven, Paul says in verse 18, and wrath is a theme in Romans here. And what he's saying here, right, is that because we're under the judgment of God, we need Christ. That's the overall point that Paul is making, so that he can then tell us how God makes us righteous and deals with the fact that we're under his wrath and addresses our need for forgiveness and justification and how that comes through faith in the work of Christ. Okay, so that's the context. We're under God's judgment, right? God's judgment against sin. All right. In this context, he talks about the homosexuality too. So all this comes together right here in this clip I want to play with a well-known media figure on CNN. He was interviewed on ABC. So this was on a program called The View that maybe you've heard of. And you won't be able to see the two of them talking here. It was a split screen remote interview. But you'll hopefully hear the audio, because when I heard this, I could not believe it. It is the epitome of what we've been talking about. Okay, let's try it.
Well, Don, to pivot, you got engaged to your fiancé, Tim, in 2019. And this morning, and you guys are so cute, we learned that the Vatican has said that the Catholic Church won't bless same-sex unions, quote, since God cannot bless sin. They go on to say that this does not imply a judgment on persons. But I want to know, do you think this sends a damaging message, and how do you feel about that, given that obviously you are now engaged and going to get married.
Well, I think listen, I respect people's right to believe in whatever they want to believe in their God. But if you believe in something that hurts another person or that does not give someone the same rights or freedoms, not necessarily under the Constitution, because this is under God, I think that that's wrong. And I think that the Catholic Church and many other churches really need to re-examine themselves and their teachings, because that is not what God is about. God is not about hindering people or even judging people. And to put it in the context of race, I find that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said the most segregated place on earth, time on earth, was 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning. So I think that religion and the pew keeps us from they're barriers from people actually getting to know each other. So I would say to the Pope and the Vatican and all Christians or Catholics or whomever, whatever religion you believe you happen to belong to out there, go out and meet people and try to understand people and do what the Bible and what Jesus actually said if you believe in Jesus, and that is to love your fellow man and judge not lest ye be not judged. So instead of having the pew hinder you, having the church hinder you, instead of...
Right. Okay, so I'm jumping back in here on my recording. Hopefully that played, but... Right. What about what we've just been reading from the Bible? Right? This is a selective reading of the Bible when you just say, God is not about judging. The Pope and the Catholic Church and all you churches out there, that would include us. He's talking about you and me. That we need to learn what Jesus said and what the Bible, he said specifically, what the Bible says. What the Bible says, that you should not judge. And what have we been studying for all these weeks in here? Where we're told God's righteous judgment is against sin. And in that very context where he talks about God's judgment against sin, he specifically mentions men with men engaging in unnatural behavior. So the very context that we're looking at speaks to that issue. But of course, Mike, another way to approach it is, if he's going to argue that we can't make judgments, well, what is he doing in that very clip? Is he not passing judgment on our beliefs? Is he not telling me I don't have a right to think that marriage is just between a man and a woman? Is he passing judgment on me? Didn't Jesus say, judge not, that you be not judged? That's what he quoted. Why is he judging me for believing that marriage is between a man and a woman? Right? And so it's contradictory, it's inconsistent, it's hypocritical. Does that mean we can't say murder's wrong? Does that mean we can't say adultery is wrong? Does that mean we can't say that slander? All the things. Look at the list of things here in this context. Going back to our list, verse 29, all manner of unrighteousness. Does this sound like when you read the Bible, it means we can never make any judgments about sin? When he says evil, covetousness. Now, he already spent a whole couple of verses, a whole paragraph in our Bibles talking about the sin of homosexuality, but now he's just adding to that. Murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. So there's a few things we want to highlight on this list before we leave chapter 1 here as well. I wanted to have a little more discussion on this. But this is the vice list we were talking about last time. But you would have to say what he is saying. That's the cultural message to the church. Stop making moral judgments about the things that the secular culture wants to declare are good and right and that we should all celebrate. So when people say that we shouldn't pass judgment, the Bible does condemn being judgmental. The Bible condemns unrighteous judgment, hypocritical judgment, hypocritical judgment. All right? Obviously, Matthew 7 and other contexts, James talks about that as well. And we find there's a right kind of judgment and a wrong kind of judgment. Like Barry brought up, Jesus said in John 7:24, judge righteous judgment. So we have to take the whole of Scripture, But what people are doing is isolating just a couple of texts that condemn hypocritical judgment or being judgmental, where we don't, where we overlook sin in ourselves while condemning it in others, or we're more critical of others than we tend to be of ourselves. We have a harsher standard for others than we want to be judged by ourselves. That's the kind of thing the Bible's talking about when it says don't judge. But if you're going to say in an absolute way, hey, you Christians, shut up and go back and read your Bible and listen to Jesus because he said you're not supposed to pass judgment. Well, we need to speak out. We need to push back against that. No, that's not what Jesus said. That's not what the Bible said. Not what the Bible says. And Paul is telling us here, we don't even need Christ. We don't need the cross, and we don't need the gospel. If God is not judging us for sin, according to that standard of not passing judgment, then there's no sin. And there's no need for the gospel. That's why Paul is talking about this at length. Well, we could talk a lot about that cultural attitude, but I just thought, it just floored me because I thought when I heard it, I said, we've got to bring that into class. It's exactly what we were talking about, the kind of spirit that we're dealing with in our culture.
Even though he proclaims to be a godly person.
Well, Barry, who are you to judge him for that? But, right, so, yes, he's claiming, I guess, to be Christian or to believe the Bible, or at least to be able to tell everyone else what the Bible says. I like how people who don't have the first clue about what's in the Bible tell Christians what they're supposed to believe. Don't you love that when people have abject ignorance of the Bible and who will stand up and lecture us on what the Bible says? Listen, you need to go back. Or, here when the big shock was that the Roman Catholic Church denounced that they still do not accept homosexual marriage. So this made headline news. Breaking! People who identify Christians believe what they've always believed for 2,000 years. Why is that breaking news? That's what the church has always believed. But see, the reason it's breaking news is we're all supposed to be changing our views. And so we're supposed to now say, oh, well, we're no longer like that church we talked about last week in San Francisco. We now realize we've been wrong. The church has been wrong for 2,000 years. Everyone in all of Christian history has never really known what the Bible said until 20 minutes ago. And now we all know, see, that it's okay to be in these kinds of illicit relationships and engage in this illicit behavior. So that's why it's news, because we're supposed to be buckling and changing and giving in. And so when you don't, and you just say, no, we believe what Orthodox Christianity has always maintained about human sexuality. What? Suddenly it's an outrage and it makes headlines. That's how much and how rapidly things are changing. Now, I have to tie up this loose end, and let me tell you why. Because last week, there was someone watching the class who said that we discussed some things that were very, very important because she knows a young lady in the church, a faithful Christian from a faithful Christian family who has a homosexual friend at school, and she has friends at school who say that they are gay, and so she struggles with, well, how can I tell them that it's wrong to be that way if that's just the way they feel, if that's just the way they are? Well, we talked about that, and I think the last couple of classes addressed the biblical perspective on that and the need for patience and compassion toward individuals who struggle with sin while still maintaining a firm stance on what the Bible says. Well, what I didn't address, though, is what would you say to someone, let's say even in the church, who struggles with same-sex desire and says, well, I didn't choose to have these feelings, I just have them. So why would it be wrong to feel this way and to be this way? If that's how I'm made, right? That's the argument Barry brought up that, well, they say you're born that way. That's the way you're born. You're born heterosexual or you're born homosexual. And the argument then would follow just as well, that you're born with pedophilic tendencies or tendencies toward other kinds of perversions. And so, first of all, we would argue it's not wrong to feel that way. What is right or wrong depends on what you do with those impulses. So we already addressed that. We already looked at that. But what I didn't address is, why do people feel that way if God doesn't make you that way? Well, this is a complex issue, and it gets into human, psychology of human behavior, and we could look at a lot and talk about a lot, and we could spend the whole class on it. But I just wanted to insert this one thing for you to think about. That I think the biblical answer as to why people have these desires, if they're unnatural, if they're not right, if they're not right to act on them, why would we have them? Why would we feel this way? Well, from the biblical perspective, right, we live in a sinful world, and sin has corrupted our world. And our bodies are affected by sin, right? That's why we get sick and die, right? Because of sin, because of the fall. Once sin entered the world, death came through sin. And so the body is affected. Human physiology, human biology is impacted by the corruption of sin that Paul is going to talk about later in Romans. He's going to talk about this in Romans chapter 5, and then again in Romans 7 and 8 in this battle with the flesh. And so this becomes an important point in Paul's argument about our need for the gospel and how the work of Christ overcomes what happened in the fall when Adam sinned. That's what he talks about. He compares Adam's sin and the consequences of that with Christ's work on the cross. But I would argue, it's my view, and I'll just leave it out there for you to consider, that the fall affected our minds as well. The fall affected our brains and our minds as well. Now, most people, most men anyway, studies have bear this out. Most men who struggle with same-sex temptation were molested as children, were sexually abused, and so that has profoundly distorted their understanding of their own sexuality. And I've had to counsel with people who've struggled that way because of those kinds of things. But it could be that someone is raised in a loving Christian home and still struggles with unwanted same-sex attraction. And we are finding more and more Christian parents who are saying, what do I do? My teenage child has come home and told me she's gay, or that she's struggling with these feelings, or that, what do we say? Okay, that would be a great discussion, especially for a parenting class or something like that. But the simple answer, I believe, is that it's because of the fall and because we live in a fallen world and the corruption of sin affects our bodies and our minds, that things aren't always right in our thinking and in our minds and in our bodies. So that the question is then, how do we deal with those things, right? That's the issue. But I thought that was important to include in here, and I know we need to move on. And just last week or whenever it was, and I've edited this photo, but think about what Paul was condemning there. He said women with women, leaving the natural use of the men. And just last week at the Grammys, there was a vulgar celebration of one of the biggest hit songs of the past year that is one of the most vulgar and disgusting songs that you could ever conceive of. And it was performed on live television, on network TV, in prime time. So we're banning Dr. Seuss and children's books, but we're allowing kids to see in prime time on network television the most vulgar displays of obscene behavior, the things that Paul specifically condemns right here in this chapter. Now later, then in the news cycle, conservative commentator Candace Owens took Cardi B to task for all that, so you may be aware of what all happened. But she was arguing, this is what we need more of. She was arguing that this was degrading to women. It's not empowering to women. And that this is hurtful to our young girls when they see this kind of behavior and when they hear the messages of these songs, that it's degrading, that it is dehumanizing, and that we should be doing better for our families and for our children. And this is what the church should be saying, and this is exactly what Paul is saying happens, though, in a culture that abandons God. But I'm just saying, it's just example after example from recent events. Okay, so the thing that we said we really wanted to highlight here is at the end of the chapter, when he says they know, I was rushing through this, but when he says, now, they know God's righteous decree that those who practice these things deserve to die. That sounds like not judging, right? Don't judge. God isn't about that, we're told. God isn't about judging. God doesn't judge us, right? God just wants us to feel good and do whatever. God is there just to give me approval to do whatever I please. No. And Paul said, deep down, everyone knows it. No one's going to be able to stand before God on the judgment day and say, well, I didn't know this kind of behavior was wrong. We're just deceiving ourselves and not being honest with ourselves, or we're hardening our consciences and we're hardening our hearts to what we really do know deep down makes us deserving of condemnation from a righteous and holy God. Now that's the other problem, is people don't conceive of God as righteous and holy. They think of God as like themselves, and that's what Paul said right here in this chapter, right? They left the knowledge of the Creator. They refused to honor the Creator, and so they gave glory to the creature. Instead, they shaped their own gods, and that's what we're saying is happening in our culture. But what we didn't really get into here, and this is the final thing in the chapter, is we did mention it, but he says they not only do these things, right? And I think maybe Barry, you mentioned it, or John or Mike or someone mentioned it, but let me see. All right, they not only do them, but they give approval. The approval is the thing here. So what we're dealing with in our culture now, I think it's just incredible that we've looked at this text, and then as we've talked about it over the last several weeks, we've just seen more and more and more and more of the kind of thing Paul's talking about. But the issue is here, why does Paul go out of his way to say that? That the problem is that not only do people do these things, but even if they don't do them, they encourage or give approval to those who do them. This issue of approval, it makes us feel better in our sin if we have approval for what we do. So in other words, it's not just enough that I'm free to engage in, say, homosexual behavior, or I'm free, if I'm a man, to dress up like a woman and pretend I'm a woman. If I have gender dysphoria, I'm mentally ill, I'm confused about my gender, that I have every right in our culture, we have the freedom to dress up as a woman and say that I'm a woman. But that's not enough. See, in our culture now, we have to give approval to those things because people don't want to feel they're being judged. They don't want even the church. They don't even want Christians to disapprove. People want approval. We want the approval of our peers. We want to be made to feel good in what we do that is sinful. It helps avoid the pangs of guilt and condemnation, right? And so this idea of giving approval to it, what I mentioned last time is we're seeing more and more now that if we don't give approval to these things, all right, think about this. What if we're known as a congregation? This has actually happened and is happening right now, but what if we're known as a congregation? You're going to have to hear me preach about some of this soon when we have a couple of sermons dealing with what Paul's talking about here in Romans 1. So forgive the repetition, but I'd like to bring out this issue because we have to decide as God's people what we're going to do. But what if we become known as a congregation that stands for traditional marriage, that we are firm in our conviction that marriage is only between a man and a woman. It's a lifelong covenant between one man and one woman joined together in a scriptural bond until death. Okay, so let's say that's discovered that where you work, that you're part of the League City Church. Oh, you're part of that church? You go to that League City Church of Christ, the Church of Christ, they're the ones that are against a homosexual marriage. You're that hateful church. And so then what happens is this becomes known. This has happened. There are numerous cases of this. The cancel culture, it's referred to, where when it's discovered that someone has associated with, even sometime in the past, but certainly if it's in the present, has associated with any conservative organization or religious group that isn't on board with transgenderism or isn't on board with the homosexual agenda, then people have lost their jobs. They've lost their livelihoods. They've lost their reputations. They've lost their careers. And so now we've reached a point, I think, where people are afraid to disapprove, right? And so we all pretend, even though we all know the emperor has no clothes, we dare not say anything because people will not tolerate any disapproval. We're being forced to either approve or at least be silent. And so let's think about how insane some of this has gotten here. This whole cancel culture, there's just example after example of it that has come up week after week after week. Right? You know about Mr. Potato Head is no longer Mr. Potato Head, but it's just the Potato Head family. And so this was being praised in this publication. Potato Head goes gender neutral. That's the big thing. Gender neutrality. And then you see right here, how can we be more inclusive? That's the new morality of our time. That where people don't mind being judgmental, then it's okay to be judgmental if you're not inclusive. And by inclusive, they mean not including you and your beliefs, your conservative Christian beliefs. No, there's no diversity allowed there. There's no inclusion allowed there. But inclusion of these behaviors that we've been pointing out the Bible condemns as sinful. But again, it's the idea of, and in this article I noticed in the video that came up, and I did a screenshot of it here, it's the idea of promoting gender equality and inclusion. Well, aren't you for equality? You're a Christian. Aren't you for inclusion? Don't you include people at your church? Well, you heard what I'm saying is each week there's another example of this. And the most recent one, to me, that's especially outrageous, let me get these other ones off the screen here, is this school, Grace Church School in New York City has put out a guideline discouraging using the terms mom and dad, or even parents, because that wouldn't be inclusive of kids who maybe go home and don't have a mom or don't have a dad. And so we're ridding the language. See, this language policing is the first step in essentially banning anything that is offensive to those in power, to those who are dictating the cultural trends. So I don't know if you heard of that particular example, but husband, wife, even boyfriend and girlfriend. Instead, you're supposed to say your partner or your significant other. And they give examples of that. And this was at one time supposedly a Christian school, I believe. Grace Church School. And now don't even want teachers and staff and people at the school using the terms mom and dad. Okay, so this is leading to what I wanted to finish with here so that we can move on in Romans. But we might look at all of this and think, these ignorant idol worshipers. We look back, Paul's condemning something that was prominent in the world that day when people were ignorant and they didn't didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have today. It was before, of course, the Enlightenment and before our advanced age, the digital age, the genetic era. We're living in this time when we have so much knowledge and understanding, even simple things. Like we wonder, didn't people know that if you don't wash your hands, you're going to spread disease? Doctors used to take bloody instruments and go from one body, or bloody rags, and go from one body to another, or one person to another when they were treating illness, and just carry the plague from one person to another person and to another person. And it's easy to look back from our perspective, once microbiology came along, and once Louis Pasteur, and once we lived through the whole Enlightenment and the rise of the scientific method and all of that, it's easy for us to look back and think, well, how dumb, how ignorant. The people didn't even know that you could pass disease that way. We would have been just as ignorant, right, if we had lived at that time. But it's also, I think, there's the temptation to look back and think, well, Paul is talking about this crass idolatry, and it's absolutely absurd. And the prophets do mock it, especially the later prophets like Isaiah. He mocks idolatry. In the latter section of the book of Isaiah, he talks about a man taking a tree, and he takes part of it, and he makes a fire to warm himself and cook his food, and with what's left over, he makes an idol and says, "Behold, you are my God who made me." And he belittles it and he mocks it. And it's easy for us to think of how ridiculous and how outrageous that people could be that way, to think that you could make something with your hands and put it inside a temple, and then have to clean it and have to and prop it up and maintain it and bring food to it, and that you could fall in front of it and beseech it to give you blessings, and to think that object could be a god. And we look back and we think, how ridiculous, how foolish. And that they could even go so far as to offer their own children, to kill their own babies in sacrifice, like in the worship of Moloch, and the expression condemned in the law and in the historical books and in the prophets, of passing their children through the fire, putting them through this burning ritual where they would be burned alive and offered in sacrifice to their gods. And as horrifying as that is, we find Israel, even after God brings them out of Egypt and they have the knowledge of God, the one true God, and they worship the golden calf, and we think they saw all the miracles in Egypt. And they saw the hand of Yahweh, the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he parted the sea and they passed through. And just a little time goes by, and now they think their God is a golden calf that Aaron just made. I like this image because as you scroll down, as they're reveling and worshiping the golden calf, there's Moses up there throwing down there's a tremendous piece of art I have to get in here. This is a painting by Nicolas Poussin of them worshiping the golden calf. 17th century Dutch painter. I think Bernard just called him Nick. His name was Nicolas Poussin. But later, as outrageous as that was, later we found Solomon worshiped many gods, right? Because of his wives. We still have till 9:45, right? And later, we find the kings of Israel. After all God did for them and after all that they knew, we find they also were sacrificing their children. They were giving their children as human sacrifices to these gods. So we look at all that and we think, how could people have engaged in idolatry? It's utterly absurd to us, right? I'm going somewhere with this. First of all, we should understand that idolatry is still prevalent today. And I don't know if, Jerry, you could flip the lights off. This would show up a lot better. But, in the Hindu religion, there's the worship of other gods. And here you can see food that is placed before these idols, these kind of grotesque-looking idols. But very sincere. I'm sure morally good people who will pray to and bow down before and touch and think there's some power in their idols and these gods that have made. There are still actual idols, and there are still crass idolatry going on in the world in different places. And these are just a few images where you see people making offerings to their gods. Okay, well, that all seems so absurd, so outrageous to us. But is it any more absurd than the idolatry that we're living through? We're now being told that you're a bigot if you think that there are only men and women. If you don't understand that biology, or rather gender, is a spectrum. And in fact, here's the gender unicorn used to teach children about how gender, there isn't just two genders, male and female, it's a whole spectrum. We're living through a time where our government officials now have passed legislation that legalizes men who are mentally ill or just pretending that they're women, or who are confused in their minds and who have gender dysphoria. And people who suffer with that deserve our compassion, but we cannot condone that behavior. We cannot endorse that kind of behavior. We can be compassionate to the individuals. But the Equality Act and some of the executive orders that have just been passed allow men to be in locker rooms undressing themselves in front of little girls, in bathrooms now. It's all about being gender inclusive. Berkeley has a locker room that is gender neutral, men and women, or whatever you are on the spectrum, you can change your clothes together. And so is it any more absurd, the idolatry of self that we're living through? Is their idolatry, their crass idolatry, any more absurd and obscene and objectionable as these kind of things we're seeing today? If you were to go back in time and tell people falling down before these idols and say, look, that's nonsense, and then tell them, oh, by the way, do you know there's no such thing as just being a man or a woman, gender is a spectrum, they think you're the stupid one. You're the one that's out of your mind. And then what's this whole idea of now with the executive orders allowing men in women's sports. In Connecticut, there's a lawsuit against the state there allowing boys who claim to be girls to compete in women's sports. And everyone stands along and cheers and says, hooray, I won the women's track meet. I won the gold medal for the girls in the race. And I'm going to the state final, for the women's state finals. When it's a man, and it's a man competing against competing against girls. But we're all supposed to pretend that there's nothing wrong with that. And here's the reverse case where a girl claimed to be a boy and competed on the boys' wrestling team and was beating the boys, but she was taking testosterone enhancers in order to convert to being a boy. And so that gave her an advantage. But this is the kind of thing we're living through, where gender reassignment surgery and all this kind of thing now, where we're allowing children to mutilate their bodies. We're allowing drag queens. Have you ever heard of Drag Queen Story Hour at your children's library? Right here in Houston, I heard on the news just a couple of days ago that one of the ones involved with this Drag Queen Bible Hour, or Bible Story Hour at your children's libraries has now been arrested for child pornography. But this is the kind of insanity, our point is, that Paul talked about in Romans when we refuse to have God in knowledge. So we need to close. It's 9:46, but the point is, we could go on and on with this sort of thing, but when we reject God, we become futile in our thinking, our understanding is darkened, we become fools, and then God hands us over to our own insanity. That is, I believe, what we're seeing escalating in our own time right now in our culture. The question is, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to that? We need to respond as God calls us to and be faithful to His Word. All right, well, we've got to finish. Thanks for your good attention. 9:46, I squeezed an extra minute in. So I'm adding this after class. I'm in my office. You might even hear some people now kind of mingling around outside and in the hallway out here after worship, but I wanted to get this in before I upload the recording because it's another example of what I was talking about, of something that has just come up in Scientific American. So a lot of this stuff going on, as absolutely insane as it is and contrary to science and reason as it is, now we're being told, well, it's science, right? For example, this article came out arguing, just since we started talking about all this, arguing that trans girls do not, in other words, boys, so they just speak as these boys who are wanting to identify as girls. They just speak of them, of course, as girls. So, but really, of course, they're boys who are confused about their gender, or who are just pretending to be girls. But they claim they have no advantage over biological girls, which is should be an unnecessary way to refer to a girl, but that's how we have to distinguish these categories now of behavior and of people. But we know, of course, biology, the science, this is Scientific American. I mean, if there's anything we can know from scientific observation, simple biology, is that there are only two genders, male and female, and that you cannot simply choose to be a gender. Your gender is determined by your biology. But see, no. Now we're told, of course, that that's bigoted to think that way, and that gender is fluid, and all of that. And if you don't believe that, even though that's what all of humanity believed until 10 minutes ago, as I like to say, if you don't believe that, then you'll be denied any place at the discussion of ideas, or in the public sphere, or in the media, or in the entertainment world, and all of that, in your academic field, all of that. That's what's going on. But this article claims that these boys who are competing against girls, that they have no biological advantage. And the nonsensical argument that they make is essentially that, well, that there are some girls who have high testosterone anyway. They can have an ovarian condition that allows them to have high testosterone. So they make this whole case about levels of testosterone relative to certain girls, and just desperately trying to put the scientific veneer on this idea that it's perfectly legitimate for a guy to claim to be a girl and then compete against other girls. It does not take into account all the many other advantages, such as a difference in metabolism, in body build, basic bone structure, and muscle response, and all of these other factors where we all know. This is why girls' sports are separate from the boys, because we all know that boys and men have a distinct advantage, that they're faster. Now, I know there are exceptions, but we all know that, with few exceptions, that men are faster, that they're stronger, that they are usually bigger. In fact, it can be even dangerous to let boys compete against girls, right? But my point is, we're all pretending, because my point is the folly of this modern idolatry, that we're the fools. When Paul says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Well, we're the ones acting like fools to go along with these outrages. And here is one that's especially egregious I want to get in here as well. This just came to my attention this past week. Also, notice once more the date here. is March 16th, and what is the date? Today's the 22nd. So this just came to my attention this past week since we've been talking about all this. And again, I'm talking about the folly of our modern idolatry. But look at the danger of it as well. A father was jailed, yes, jailed in British Columbia in Canada, Vancouver, I believe it is. He was jailed after referring to his biological female child as his daughter. He was under a court order. His 14-year-old daughter who's had all kinds of behavioral problems, according to the father, is claiming that she's really a boy. And so you will not believe, a judge ordered her father not to refer to her with feminine pronouns and not to refer to him as his daughter. So a court was ordering a man whose 14-year-old child, his 14-year-old daughter, she's a biological woman who's claiming to be a boy, and the court is saying he cannot refer to her as a boy. Now I just have to show you a couple things here about this story really quickly, and you may have already heard of this. And people who are watching way off in the future, this may be so dated. It's the year 2021. This is what's going on. This was what was going on in our day. I hope if you're watching this way off in the future that there's been a Christian cultural revival and a return to the fear of God, and that this kind of nonsense and this kind of insanity has passed. I hope it has not destroyed Western civilization. If so, then probably none of this is going to be available to anyone anyway. But you just have to see some of the details of this story, and want you to understand then if you are watching from the distant future, this was new. I mean, this is what was happening in our day. But the warrant was issued for his arrest because he referred to his daughter as his daughter, using the pronouns she and her. And the man's last name is Hoogland, and he's now a prisoner of conscience. But yes, that was the outrage. Okay, now, but I actually read the court order that was legally forbidding him from referring to her that way. But here's the worst part. Let me get to a couple more pieces from this story here, if I can get it. Okay, so let's see if I got the right. Yeah. All right. So notice that this is just staggering what is happening, where he says here in this final paragraph, if I can mark it, you'll see where I am here. I know it takes me a minute to find all these different tools. It's distracting, I know, but I think it's worth it. Here's the part I'm referring to right here. Where is that tool? I cannot find it. It's gone. Oh, here it is. Okay, right here. I'm right here. So Hoogland discovered, you probably already finished reading it. Hoogland discovered that the school had been showing his daughter this curriculum, the Going Sexual and Gender Identity Educational Materials in British Columbia. So they're getting these things into our schools. They're indoctrinating our children. Notice he says that amounts to really propaganda. But in grade 7, in the grade 7 yearbook, the child was referred to by a different name than the name her parents gave her. The school counselor changed the child's name without telling her parents. The school socially transitioned the biologically female child on its own initiative with the input of gender ideologue psychologist Dr. Wallace Wong. So, in other words, this was all against the wishes of the child's father, her own father. And most incredible of all, right here, let me pull this up. Most incredible of all is that, now let's just read it. Hoogland, in contrast, thinks his daughter's best interests lie in preserving his child's health. In case his child ends up, notice they keep saying his child instead of daughter, among the estimated 85% of children who desist in their belief that they are the opposite sex once puberty ends. So in other words, kids who are confused about their gender almost always, by the time they pass through puberty, they identify as their true biological gender, and they pass through that confusion and no longer claim to be transgender. And yet we're letting these children make decisions contrary to the wishes of their own parents to take body-altering drugs that can have permanent debilitating effects, mutilate their bodies, having gender reassignment surgeries and cutting off their genitals. I mean, these are horrific things going on in our culture. They're absolutely unthinkable. And I think this is worst of all right here, because in that last paragraph it says, the judge went a step further, declaring that the girl's parents must affirm their child's gender identity and refer to the child as though the fact of her being a gender non-conforming biological female who identifies as transgender means that the child is a boy. But here's the worst part. And if he did not, the parents would be implicated of the criminal offense of family violence. That's right. That would be considered violence. You know, not the mutilation of the child, not taking this poor confused girl and giving her drugs that could make it impossible for her ever to have children, ever to have a family. No, that's not doing violence to the child, but her own parents referring to her as their daughter and refusing to believe this nonsense, this lie that she can just declare herself a boy and that makes her a boy. That is not only being ordered by the court, or that is considered violence by the court. Violence! What is happening? What is happening, dear friends, beloved brethren? This is what we're dealing with. This is the insanity of the moral depravity that Paul talks about here in this context. And this is why I say we are still living in an idolatrous culture. It's just the idolatry of self-identification, being able to identify as any gender you want, being able to declare your own identity and to be the final judge of your behavior. It's all the idolatry of the self. We are living in a neo-paganism, an absolute paganism that is every bit as ludicrous, every bit as dangerous and damning and destructive, in fact, more so than the idolatry of the ancient pagans that Paul was condemning in Romans chapter 1. I hope we'll stand against these things and stand for the truth of the gospel in the face of this growing hostility. And when you think, one last thing on the next slide and I'm done. Notice that Paul said here, he talked about disobedient to parents. And I did not mention either. You're seeing that in that case. My point is that we're telling these children that their parents don't know better than the child. That we're telling these children they know better than their parents, that they do not have to obey their parents. The state is telling children in the name of idolizing the self. See, that's what it's all about, is affirming the self, no matter how ludicrous, no matter how ridiculous it is. There is this undermining of parental authority. But of course, I didn't mention either. I have mentioned it before, but I've mentioned it so much I thought it would be understood, but we could spend a whole class talking about this, and a whole class and more, that of course, just as they offered up their children in sacrifice in their idolatry, so we are as well. We kill our babies in sacrifice to the God of convenience. And so, we're seeing the same kind of disrespect for the sanctity of human life in the legalized murder of the unborn. to think that we will actually allow a mother to have her own baby in her womb brutally and painfully dismembered. Why? Why? Such a monstrosity, such an unthinkable evil. Oh, it's all about the idolatry, the idolatry Paul talks about here. That's what it leads to, where your own desires and whatever you want and your own comfort and your own convenience reign supreme. Then nothing else matters, not even the life of your own precious child. And it's about not only allowing that, but of course forcing the taxpayers to pay for it. We all remember have to give approval. We have to give approval to these things. That's a part of the wickedness of the idolatry of the self, is that in our insistence of having our own way, we are insisting that everyone else endorse that. And not only endorse it, not only allow it, but fund it. And I could talk, as you know, and I have talked a lot about this, but I just wanted to make sure to include that there so that when we started the next class, we could finally move on to chapter 2. But dear Lord, help us to show Christ and the way of truth. In this time of growing darkness, dear Lord, make us the light that we need to be. And I just have to show you, I'm sitting here in my office after class, and it's historic. It's a historic Sunday for me because not only did I wear the red jacket, but check this out. For the first time ever, I wore sneakers in my home congregation because I wanted the red shoes to go with the red jacket and the red socks. Couldn't make up my mind on the laces, but yeah, still. I thought it looked pretty good. Take in the glory. God bless.